The auction room was stuffy, a place where the air seemed heavy, almost stagnant. It was a Halloween night, one of those nights when the wind seems to whisper ancient secrets, and the sky seemed darker than usual. The collector was sitting in a corner, observing the old objects with a sharp gaze, as if searching for something specific. She was a lover of everything old, curious, and slightly sinister. She liked the feeling of owning something with a history, with mysteries rooted in time. That night, she hoped to find a new piece for the collection. She didn't know exactly what, but she felt that something was waiting for her there. The bids were flying between the participants. Works of art and antiques passed through the hands of eager buyers. But suddenly, her eyes were drawn to a strange object. In the back of the room, a doll. It was a strange-looking doll, almost human, but marked by time. Her clothes were worn, her eyes a glassy shade of grayish blue that seemed to follow whoever looked at her. It was an item that few dared to look at, let alone buy, and she knew she should pass on it. But something about that worn yet sharp expression made her hesitate. Without realizing it, her hand rose to bid. The doll was sold without a fight, as if no one else in the room wanted to have that object in their possession. Some gave her suspicious looks, as if they knew something she didn't. The collector left the auction with the doll tightly cradled in her arms, almost reverently. But the feeling that something was wrong continued to haunt her. Even when she got home, when she placed the doll in a corner of her collection, she felt a slight shiver run down her spine, as if she had been involved in something that was beyond her comprehension. However, she ignored it. She took a deep breath and turned away, convincing herself that it was just a new and fascinating piece of work. Yet as she walked away, the weight of the doll's eyes seemed to follow her. On the first night, nothing but silence filled the house. The collector slept soundly, satisfied with her new acquisition, believing that the doll was nothing more than an old object, worn by time and by the hands that had carried it. But at dawn, something was strange. She noticed that a chair had been moved. It was a small, almost insignificant detail, but it disturbed her. She wondered if she had forgotten the chair there, or if she was letting herself be carried away by a slight anxiety. With a sigh, she convinced herself that it was just an impression. On the second night, however, the feeling of discomfort returned, more intense. She was getting ready for bed when she heard a soft whisper echoing through the hallway. A sound so low and subtle that it could almost be mistaken for the wind outside. She stopped, motionless, listening carefully, and soon the sound stopped, leaving her alone with the silence. She rationalized that the noise was coming from outside, perhaps a poorly closed window. She walked to the room where she had left the doll, but her heart almost stopped when she noticed that it was in a different place than where she had left it. Not in the corner of the room, but on a dresser, facing the door. The doll's eyes seemed colder, as if the expression on its face changed every day. The collector felt a twinge of fear, but forced herself to remain calm. "It's just an old doll," she muttered to herself. After all, she had always dealt with strange objects and had never felt true fear. But that night, As she lay down, the sound of whispers returned, filling the room with an incomprehensible murmur. She felt restless, unable to fall asleep completely, as if an invisible presence was in the next room. And even with her exhausted body, sleep would not come. She turned to the side, trying to forget the noise, but the sound continued, like a macabre song coming from the depths. At dawn, once again, she tried to convince herself that it was just the weight of the day. But deep down, she began to feel that the doll carried something with it that she still couldn't understand. The days that followed were marked by a growing sense of unease. The once peaceful nights now seemed endless. Every sound, every shadow felt closer, more real. The house, which had once been a refuge of comfort, now seemed to watch her every step. On the third night, the discomfort reached its peak. She awoke in the middle of the night with a heavy sensation, as if something was closely watching her. Heart racing, she tossed the blanket aside, feeling an icy chill of fear crawl up her spine. Though she couldn't explain why, she forced herself out of bed and slowly opened the bedroom door. The hallway was dark, and the silence was thick as fog. She moved with careful steps, each one sounding louder in her ears. Her eyes, adjusting to the darkness, soon noticed something at the end of the corridor. The doll was there, sitting on the floor, directly facing her bedroom, its head tilted, glassy eyes shining eerily in the dim hallway light, fixed on her with a chilling intensity. For a moment, she was paralyzed, fighting the urge to run. I left it in the office, she thought, her voice trembling with fear. Taking a deep breath, she decided to ignore the panic creeping into her mind. She tried to be practical. Perhaps she had moved the doll in an act of sleepwalking. With a slight tremor in her hands, she picked it up and returned it to the office, setting it back on the shelf, trying to position it so its eyes wouldn't stare directly at her. As she left, she closed the office door firmly, as if to seal away something beyond the doll itself. But as she walked back down the hallway to her room, a distant, whispered laughter echoed, low and dark. She stopped, frozen, every cell in her body rigid with terror. Back in her room, she lay down but couldn't close her eyes. The feeling of being watched, of an invisible presence nearby, was overwhelming. It felt as though something hovered over her, waiting for the right moment to act. She tried to rationalize. It was just a doll. Only that. But deep down, she knew there was more. Something far beyond what she could explain. That night, as sleep finally overcame her, she had a dream. In the dream, she was in the same hallway, but the walls were faded, covered with dark stains. At the end of the hall, the doll was there again, only smiling, its lips moving in a whisper, calling her name. Upon waking, she realized she was no longer alone in her fear. Something or someone was inhabiting her house and had no intention of leaving anytime soon. That morning, the collector woke up with a heavy body, her eyes stinging from exhaustion. She felt drained, as if the house had sucked away her strength throughout the night. But now, resolute, she knew she couldn't continue like this. Something had to be done, and fast. She went to the office. The doll was in the same place where she had left it, with its head tilted, glassy blue eyes fixed directly on the door. Those eyes, cold and devoid of any human warmth, seemed to follow her. For a moment she thought she saw the shadow of a smile on the doll's lips, a cold, menacing smile. "I can't take this anymore," she whispered, mustering all the courage she had left. With swift movements she wrapped the doll in a dark cloth, tying the knots tightly as if to trap whatever was inside. She descended the stairs, clutching the bundle close to her chest, and went to the basement, the one place in the house she rarely visited. It was dark and damp, filled with old boxes and forgotten furniture. There, she hid it inside a wooden box, stacking other boxes on top, creating a barrier between her home and that thing. She felt immediate relief, a sense of freedom as she climbed back up the stairs. She took a deep breath, telling herself that it was over, that it had all just been an excess of imagination. Finally, she would have a peaceful night. But that very night, sleep would not come. Each passing minute brought a new wave of unease. She tried not to think about the doll, the basement, the shadows, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The silence in the house carried a sinister weight, as if the walls were alive, breathing in sync with her heartbeat. Suddenly, she heard a distant noise, a muffled sound, like something being dragged. Her body froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound was coming from the hallway. A short breath escaped her lips as she saw, in the dim light of the hallway lamp, a shadow that seemed small and motionless, as if waiting in the darkness. With slow, hesitant steps, she moved closer, her throat dry with fear. And there, at the entrance to her bedroom, it was. The doll, this time sitting in a chair next to her bed. The dark cloth that had wrapped it now lying on the floor, as if it had been torn away. The collector stood paralyzed, staring at the doll's face, which seemed to glow with a subtle, unnatural light. The wooden lips were curved in a faint, almost satisfied smile. The doll wanted more than just her presence. She could feel it now, with chilling clarity. The collector could barely sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the doll. That empty expression, the sinister smile that seemed to intensify. It was not a simple doll. It was a presence, a shadow that invaded every corner of her house, every space in her mind. By morning, the decision had been made. She needed to destroy that thing. Only that could bring her peace. With trembling hands, she picked up the doll and went down to the basement once more. She took a deep breath and in a fit of desperation picked up a heavy hammer. When she raised her arm to destroy the doll, she felt a paralyzing chill. It was as if something invisible was stopping her, freezing her muscles. The doll's gaze seemed to penetrate her, whispering directly into her mind, almost like a silent threat. Her hands were shaking and an icy sensation rose up through her body. It was an indescribable fear, as if by breaking the doll she would release something much worse. The collector tried to pull away, but a force seemed to hold her in place. The surroundings seemed to vibrate with an evil energy. And then the doll tilted its head slightly, a slight movement but undeniable. Her heart was beating so hard it hurt. She felt overwhelmed, her mind clouded with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. It was then that she looked at the basement mirror, and there she saw something that made her recoil. Next to her, reflected in the glass, was a female figure, translucent, with empty eyes and lips curved in the same smile as the doll. She turned quickly, but there was no one there, just her and the doll. Her reflection in the mirror, however, was no longer her own. It was a distorted version of herself, with the same empty eyes and cold smile as the doll, as if something was watching her from within. A suffocating sensation enveloped her, and a final wave of despair took over her mind. She wanted to scream, but her voice failed her. The spirit trapped in that doll, she knew now, wanted her life, her body, her identity. She felt her own expression change, her lips involuntarily curving into that cold, empty smile, while in the mirror, the doll's figure seemed to become more alive. What remained of her sanity was slipping away as she stared into the mirror. That distorted figure, with its dark, bloodshot eyes and sadistic smile, was her, but at the same time, it was no longer her. As if she were watching herself through a veil, she felt something taking over her mind, infiltrating every corner of her consciousness. The mirror still reflected her image, but the room around her seemed different now. The shadows were denser, moving in a slow, sinister rhythm, seeming to vibrate in response to the rapid beating of her heart. She tried to back away, but it was as if her feet were stuck to the floor. Terror enveloped her like a cloud, suffocating and inescapable. The collector forced herself to look away from the mirror and tried to move away. But out of the corner of her eye, she saw the doll, now beside her, even though it had been left meters away. It was as if there was some kind of link between them, something dark and ancient, far beyond what she could comprehend. Her own hand slowly rose to her face, touching it. It was a strange sensation, as if her skin was no longer hers, as if another presence were there, controlling every movement. She whispered in a whisper, "I am not you." And then a low, hoarse, insidious voice echoed in her mind, a voice that seemed to come from both inside and outside. "You are mine now." A cold chill ran down her spine. In the mirror, she saw her face completely transform, a malignant expression taking the place where before there had been only panic. She watched, helpless, as her own image merged with the doll's face, their features merging into something monstrous and cruel. With a last breath of consciousness, she understood what had happened. She had been taken, possessed by the curse that inhabited that doll, which was now reflected in her eternally. As the room plunged into darkness, the figure in the mirror remained. A cruel smile, empty eyes. The collector was no more. Sarah wasn't the type to scare easily. Living alone in a small downtown apartment, she had grown used to solitude. The silence of the nights brought her a certain comfort, a pause from the bustle of the world outside. From the 10th floor, she had a view of the building across the street, its square windows always lit, offering glimpses into other people's lives. Now and then she would watch the movements inside like a silent soap opera, but that night, something was different. She was distracted, looking out the window without any particular reason, when she noticed a figure. At first it seemed just another shadow in the apartment across the street, but then her eyes adjusted. The figure was clear. A clown. Sarah smiled slightly. It was probably a Halloween decoration. The day was coming up after all. It was only natural for people to decorate their homes with frightening figures. A clown standing in the window of another apartment. Just part of the celebration. She looked away and continued scrolling through her phone, as she often did on long, lonely nights. But for some reason that figure unsettled her. There was something strange about the way the clown was positioned. It seemed fixed, motionless, but in an unsettling way. And it was staring directly at her window, always at her. Without realizing it, Sarah looked outside again. The clown was still there. It hadn't moved an inch. Its round face, painted with a wide smile, now looked more eerie than festive. Its eyes, empty and cold. The feeling of being watched made her quickly look away. It's just a decoration, she thought, nothing more. But something was beginning to stir inside her. In the days that followed, Sarah tried to ignore the clown. After all, she knew it was nothing more than a Halloween decoration, a silly attempt by some neighbor to add a spooky touch to their home. And yet, every night, when the lights of the building went out, it was still there, always in the same window, always looking at her. It was nearly impossible not to notice. When she sat down to work at her computer, it was as if she could feel its presence. Even without wanting to, her eyes were drawn to that window, where the clown continued to stand, unmoving, as if waiting for something. It didn't blink, it didn't move, but its painted smile seemed wider every time she looked. The feeling of discomfort grew. Something about that clown felt wrong. More than once she found herself wondering if it might not just be a plastic figure or some kind of doll. Maybe it was someone, a real person, masked, standing there for days on end. But that was impossible, wasn't it? No one would stand still for so long, day after day, night after night. One night, feeling the weight of unease, Sarah decided to ask some of her neighbors if they'd also noticed the clown. The response was always the same. Probably just a Halloween decoration, nothing to worry about. But with each passing night, Sarah felt the opposite. Something was very wrong with it. Finally, her curiosity overpowered her fear. On impulse, she crossed the street and entered the building across from hers. The doorman looked at her strangely when she asked to speak to the resident of that apartment, the one with the clown. That apartment? He shook his head. No one lives there, ma'am. It's been empty for months. No visitors, no decorations. You must be mistaken. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She quickly turned, forcing a nervous smile as she thanked the doorman. When she returned home that night, discomfort turned into genuine fear. As she pulled back her apartment curtains, her eyes went straight to the window across the street. The clown was still there, motionless, smiling at her. She stepped back from the window, her heart racing, anxiety building. Whatever it was, it no longer seemed like a simple decoration. It was something more, something sinister. The nights had become unbearable. Sarah felt as if the clown were watching her every move, that grotesque smile always painted on its mask, eyes fixed on her. Knowing that no one lived in the apartment across the street only made it more terrifying. How could a figure appear there night after night, in an empty space? Halloween was approaching, and the city was filling with eerie decorations and spooky ornaments. But nothing seemed more disturbing to Sarah than the clown in the window. She could no longer ignore it. Her days were consumed by thoughts of it, and her nights were even worse, each glance out the window intensifying her growing dread. On Halloween Eve, Sarah woke up determined. She needed to resolve this. There was something more to that figure, and she couldn't rest until she uncovered what it was. Once again, she went to the building across the street, this time intent on going up to the apartment. Maybe the doorman was wrong. Maybe someone was living there after all. Perhaps it was all just a misunderstanding. But deep down, she knew it didn't make sense. She insisted with the doorman, who reluctantly agreed to accompany her to the apartment. They went up together in the elevator, and when they arrived at the dark, silent hallway, a chill ran down her spine. The doorman struggled to unlock the door, but when the lights turned on, the apartment was completely empty. No furniture, no signs of life, no clown, no decorations. The place looked like it had been abandoned for a long time. "I told you, miss," the doorman said with a wary tone. "There's no one here." Sarah could barely respond. She felt panic rising, her mind struggling to process what it all meant. She thanked the doorman and hurried back to her apartment, heart pounding, mind in turmoil. But that night, for the first time in weeks, the clown didn't appear. The window across the street was empty, dark, with no sign of the horrifying figure. For a moment, Sarah thought it might finally be over. But the relief was short-lived. The silence in her home, so heavy, felt more sinister now. She lay down, trying to push away the fear. When the city lights dimmed and the night deepened, Sarah turned in bed. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to sleep. But something inside her knew that the true terror was yet to come. On Halloween night, Sarah felt more nervous than ever. The silence in her apartment was oppressive, almost suffocating. She tried to distract herself by watching TV or scrolling through her phone. But something was wrong. The feeling of being watched, which had once come from the window across the street, now seemed to be coming from inside her own home. The hours passed slowly. The night outside was dark and cold, and the faint sounds from the street, children's laughter, distant fireworks, only intensified the loneliness she felt. She couldn't explain why, but something told her she wasn't alone. Then, as she passed through the living room, something made her stop. Beside the window was an old, large mirror she had inherited from her grandmother. As she passed by it, something caught her eye. A glint. Something strange. She approached slowly, her heart racing, and then, when she looked closer, her blood ran cold. In the reflection behind her stood the clown. He wasn't in the window of the building across the street. No, this time he was inside her home, standing right behind her. His face was even more grotesque, with that twisted smile, empty, wide eyes and smeared paint as if it were melting. But what terrified her most was that he wasn't just smiling. He was moving, slowly, leaning closer toward her. Sarah spun around, horrified, expecting to find someone behind her, but there was nothing. The room was empty. Only the silence of the night surrounded her. She turned back to the mirror, and the clown was still there, closer now, with that wide, disturbing grin, as if he were amused by her fear. Sarah's heart pounded, and she began to shake, stepping back from the mirror, eyes wide with terror. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. The clown was trapped in the reflection, but it was as though he were about to break through that barrier and materialize in her dark room. The feeling that something terrible was about to happen enveloped her like a cold shroud. Panic took hold of her. Sarah ran to her bedroom and slammed the door, desperate to keep anything at all on the other side. But the feeling of being watched, it didn't fade. She was trapped. and the clown wasn't going to leave so easily. Sarah was locked in her bedroom, panting, her sweaty hands trembling as she clutched the doorknob. The silence of her apartment, once comforting, now felt suffocating. The echo of her own breathing was all she could hear, but she knew something was out there. Something was waiting. She stepped back from the door, her heart still racing. That clown, that smile, the way it moved in the mirror. This wasn't a game. She was being hunted. The mirror in the hallway, the distorted reflection. It was all real, more real than anything she had ever felt. Trying to calm herself, Sarah glanced around the room, searching for something she could use as a weapon. But what could she possibly do against something like that? She didn't know what it was, let alone how to stop it. Suddenly, a low, dragging sound came from outside the door, a noise, as if something was being pulled across the floor. Sarah felt her body freeze in terror. That sound, it was getting louder, closer. No, she whispered, backing up against the wall, her eyes locked on the door. Then the doorknob began to turn, slowly. Desperation took hold of her. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. She knew that if that door opened, she would be face to face with the thing that was stalking her. The sound of the metal turning inch by inch filled the room, mingling with the sound of her own ragged breaths. The doorknob stopped. For a moment, there was absolute silence. But then, in the bedroom mirror, she saw him and let out a scream. The clown was there behind her, smiling, his eyes locked onto hers, hands reaching out. He looked as if he were about to grab her. Sarah lunged for the door, trying to escape, but she knew she couldn't outrun him anymore. Sarah couldn't think. Her mind was overwhelmed by pure, relentless terror. The image of the clown in the mirror haunted her, as if etched into her soul. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to flee. But where? There was no escape. She was surrounded, trapped in her own home. She felt his presence drawing closer, an invisible weight filling the room, the air growing cold and stifling. Stumbling backward, she tripped and fell beside her bed. Glancing at the mirror in the room, she saw him, closer than ever. The clown's smile twisted cruelly, as if he was savoring her fear. His pale face looked more alive than any doll or decoration. "What do you want from me?" she screamed, her voice thick with panic. But the clown did not respond. His hollow eyes continued to pierce her, reaching deep into her soul. He took another step forward, breaching the boundary of the reflection. The glass seemed to shatter soundlessly, as if the mirror was just a door, a passage between worlds. She watched as his hand emerged first, stretching toward her, and in that moment, she knew there was no way back. The clown was in the room now. She tried to scream, but the sound caught in her throat. The figure advanced slowly, each movement deliberately measured, as if savoring each second. The twisted smile remained, eyes wide, devoid of any trace of humanity. Sarah closed her eyes. Her mind reeled, fear so intense that her body refused to respond. She felt the cold, rough hand grip her shoulder, its weight pressing her deeper into darkness. This was the end. And then everything went silent. A profound, all-consuming silence filled the space where she lay. The last thing Sarah heard was the soft, distorted laughter of the clown, before the world around her faded to nothingness.